The support is the blind support of the countries in this part of the world that enables Israeli atrocities, that enables these monstrous actions that we've been witness to. So we need, a very large-scale democratization, a rehumanization. I won't even say democratization, as a basic rehumanization. We need to relearn the sanctity of human life.
Welcome to this book launch of the book by Pankaj Mishra. Pankaj is an Indian writer who was born in India, but has lived in this country since 2009. He's a novelist, an award-winning author, and I'm delighted to be here asking him about his latest book, The World After Gaza. Pankaj, your book is an extraordinary work combining hard historical and political analysis, moral purpose, and personal memoir. Can you say a little bit about how you came to discover the appalling reality of Palestine?
To answer your question, Sabby, I think my real education began only after I went to Israel and the occupied territories, and came to realize that I had to very quickly abandon my romantic notions about Israel, which, by the way, had survived all this education. So all this education in Palestinian history still hadn't told me, until I saw for myself, how Israel had become a violently expansionist power. That whatever claims it might have had as a nation state, an urgently created nation state after the Holocaust, as a home for the survivors of the Holocaust, because very few countries actually wanted survivors of the Holocaust, including people who had won the Second World War, who today claim to have liberated the death camps. Those countries did not want Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. And so many of them were forced to go to Israel. I was aware of that history. But then after going to Israel, I realized that like a lot of nation states, Israel had become something else. That it had broken free from the earliest aspirations for an egalitarian socialistic state that many ways motivated, some of the Zionists, at least back in the early 20th century, that it had become essentially an imperialistic nation state that was not at all interested in creating a state for Palestinians, was in fact only interested in expanding at the expense of its neighbors, at the expense of the Palestinians. And that is what was powering Israeli policy. And everything else that we were being told about it, about the so-called two-state solution, about liberal Zionism, was a cruel deception. You won't find some of the most sort of prominent commentators on this subject, they still won't recognize that Israel has had absolutely zero interest in creating a life of freedom and dignity for the Palestinians. None whatsoever. So what we are seeing today is a more deranged form of this expansionism. But the basic impulse to dominate, to oppress, to expand was always there.
How would you describe, how would you analyze the current attack on Iran and presumably the desire to destroy Iran's oil-producing capacity?
I think it's very important to actually identify the moment when the United States became profoundly interested in treating Israel as an ally. You have to remember, I write about this in my book, that American presidents after 1945 often took an extremely harsh line with Israel. Only after 1967 that they started to think of Israel as a reliable partner, because the Americans at that point, you'll remember, were getting humiliated in Vietnam. And the Soviets were again dominant in most of the Arab countries in the Middle East. And for them, suddenly Israel, with its formidable military machinery, became an attractive country. And so they decided to start supporting Israel. Up until that point, the country that provided the maximum number of, for instance, weapons to Israel was not the United States. It was European country. It was Germany. At some point, it turns into also an emotional affinity. It turns into an ideological affinity, because here is a pioneer state. Decades and decades after the United States itself ceased to be a pioneer state, but a state that is still expanding with a kind of violence and ferocity that becomes, for many Americans, just as it was for someone like myself in India, a source of great attraction for Israel. Claiming their love for Israel, it's an attraction to the kind of impunity, recklessness, violence that Israel now embodies. And I think that became a very important part of this relationship that the Americans started to have with Israel. So while it's important to actually point to, the geopolitical configurations here, and to see Israel as, doing the dirty work, as the German Chancellor very usefully put it the other day, Israel is doing the dirty work for us. He actually said that out aloud. It's important to see all this, but I think it's also important to point out the psychological, emotional identification and attraction for Israel, which is really an attraction for a country that unleashes violence in a way that ideally they would like to unleash. Perhaps they will unleash that violence next week on Iran. But I think that is something that, again, we should be focusing a lot more on, because we've known for a long time about how Israel really is a kind of, proxy for Western power in the region. And I think the upsurge right at this moment, when Israel seems to be in its most murderous, genocidal mood, is a very remarkable, it's a very significant moment. I think you have to ask yourself, why is it that a country that was once supported by some of the most principled people in the world, and we have to ask ourselves the question, why do some of the worst people in the world today admire Israel? What is it about Israel that makes them so infatuated with it? And I think the answer really is what connects the deranged president of Argentina to Viktor Orban, to Donald Trump, to some of the most notorious anti-Semites in Western Europe and the United States, to some of the most fanatical Christian evangelists, is this attraction to recklessness, to monstrous violence, and the ability to sort of commit atrocities without any kind of, without any checks, and certainly no punishment whatsoever, no resistance whatsoever.
The Holocaust, is constantly referred to in Israeli propaganda as justification for what they do to the Palestinians. But there isn't that Israel itself, the society and its individual citizens, have this pathology. One can only describe it as a psychopathology, whereby they cope with their own anger and their own anxiety by becoming the oppressors.
Able to witness at least some of these grotesque episodes from this destruction of Gaza, of Israeli soldiers dressing up in the lingerie of dead or expelled Palestinian women, various other similarly obscene and ghastly images that we've been assaulted with over the last 2 years. And then, of course, Israelis demonstrating in large numbers to prevent food from getting into Gaza. There are many other examples which show that this is a profoundly radicalized society. I think it's too easy now to talk about the far-right extremists, the Jewish supremacists who run the state of Israel today. Poll after poll, opinion polls showing that the Israelis believe, large numbers of them, sometimes the majority of them, that the Israeli Defense Force hasn't caused enough damage on people living in Gaza. Large numbers of people saying Trump's plan for a Riviera should be realized. Large numbers believing, and again, by large numbers I mean majorities in every case, believing that Gaza should be ethnically cleansed and there should be no mercy for the Palestinians. We have to start, kind of looking at this with many more resources than, say, geopolitical or social analyses or economic analysis, because we are really looking at people who have been educated, who've been indoctrinated in certain ways. And what are those ways? I think continuously telling people, generation after generation, that the entire world is against you. And a second Holocaust is imminent at any given time. That the people who are fighting for their rights, such as the Palestinians, are potential Nazis. This is really creating generation after generation of fearful, traumatized people who, when the moment comes, will erupt, as we've seen, into genocidal violence. And the climate in which Israel can do whatever it likes, and the people criticizing it are going to be brutally crushed. Not only would Western political leaders or the media class not mount any vigorous criticism itself or themselves, it would actually delegitimize, marginalize, ostracize people who dare to criticize Israel. And that is what we've been saying over the last almost 2 years now. On a sort of, from Australia to Canada, the sort of so-called Western powers, the way they have come together to enforce the stifling consensus that Israel has a right to defend itself. And as part of that right, they say basically it can do whatever it wants to do, and we will continue to support it.
So have we not seen a growing rift between the ruling classes in the West that continue to support Palestine, Israel, come what may, and the mass of ordinary people who've been increasingly motivated to mobilize in support of Palestine?
What we are really looking at is a much broader, a very serious dysfunction of democratic institutions, of the democratic process, a profound corruption, a capture by special interests, by lobby groups. And here we are, back in 2003, if you'll remember, there was still some pretense that governments in Western Europe, in this country and the United States, indulged in, which was, let's have a debate about whether we should go to war in Iraq. Let's have a conversation about this, debates in House of Commons, in the columns of the press, in the BBC. Today, no debate whatsoever. The Prime Minister is going to decide in the next few days whether to support Donald Trump in his assault on Iran. You're not going to be consulted about this. The media class is already whipping up a hysteria over this. Look at the way the BBC is covering the destruction of Iran. So I think we are in a real sense not functional democracies anymore. The opinions and views of ordinary people don't count. If you look at surveys, opinion polls in country after country, one European country after another, let alone Asia and Africa, majorities have demanded a ceasefire in Palestine. Majorities have supported an arms embargo against Israel. Why are these people not being listened to? I think there is a great elemental need human need for brotherhood, for solidarity, for fraternity, for community. And for a very long time, those needs were met in the public sphere by socialistic movements, by left-leaning movements, organizing people, bringing them together in a sort of shared struggle for a better society, a more just society. I would be lying if I said that I do not experience such emotions of hopelessness and despair and grief. I think all of us, perhaps, have to suffer those emotions on a regular basis. If we want to remain people connected to the world, I mean, it's one thing to turn off the news. I've also tried that, but again, that feels like a kind of moral abdication and callousness. So you have to engage, you have to keep engaged, and yet the news is so demoralizing. It's so destructive of your, whatever kind of inner peace you want to hold on to. At the same time, is there any alternative to coming together, to talking about these things, to organizing, to educating, to getting the message out, and hoping that these modest efforts would amount to something? What is the alternative? To sit there and become completely susceptible to total despair, to be completely paralyzed by despair and sadness and rage. I think we have to keep engaging. We have to keep talking about all this. We have to keep thinking. And so I think we really need to discover some very basic things that make us human. Empathy, compassion, and things that have kind of disappeared from our public lives. And so I don't want to leave it to the Arabs or the Palestinians for this. I think we need a broader rehumanization.
Right. We thank Pankaj for his excellent contribution to the evening. To thank the Gary McLaren and the staff of the Owl Bookshop. Are you okay to thank copies of the book? So, thank you all for coming. I urge everybody to buy a copy of Pankaj's book. Pankaj will sign copies, which are available here. Right.